The champagne was surprisingly cold. Not the pleasant chill of a celebratory toast, but the biting, invasive cold of a deliberate assault. It cascaded over my head, a sticky waterfall of expensive mockery, plastering my dark hair to my scalp and cheeks. Each drop that traced a path down my neck and onto the cheap torn fabric of the maid's uniform felt like a separate, distinct violation. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished wood floor, on the reflection of the grand crystal chandelier above, its light splintered into 1,000 dazzling, indifferent stars by the puddle forming around my knees. A bowl of uncooked rice sat before me, some grains scattered like tiny white tears on the gleaming surface. The heavy chain around my neck was a solid, grounding weight, connecting me to the quiet beagle sitting beside me, his warm presence the only kindness in the room. He didn't flinch. He just watched the scene with wide brown eyes, a silent, unwilling participant in my degradation. I could hear the faint, suppressed titters from the circle of tuxedos and sequined gowns that surrounded me, a perfect, glittering cage of polite cruelty. They were watching a show and I was the evening's entertainment. My fiancé, Julian, stood somewhere in that circle, his silence a roar louder than any of their whispered jeers. I focused on my breathing, a slow, deliberate inhale through my nose, a controlled exhale through my mouth. They thought they were breaking me. They saw a poor, pathetic girl in a ridiculous costume brought to her knees. What they couldn't see was the switch that had flipped inside my mind. They couldn't feel the ice forming in my veins, a cold fury so pure and so absolute, it was almost peaceful. If you've ever been made to feel small, to feel worthless by people who have nothing but the luck of their birth to stand on, then you understand the fire that was beginning to burn behind my lowered eyelids. If you know that feeling, that deep, gut-wrenching injustice, do me a favor and hit that like button, because you know this isn't an ending. It's a beginning. The people in this room thought they were witnessing a humiliation. They had no idea they were attending a funeral, their own. But to understand the cold, diamond-hard resolve hardening in my heart, you have to understand how I got here, kneeling in a puddle of vintage champagne. To understand the fury, you have to understand the hope that came before it. It all started 72 hours earlier. Born from a question that love should never have to ask. Are you strong enough? My world, the one I built myself, operates on logic. It runs on code, on algorithms, on the immutable law of merit. At 28, I was Eleanor Vance, founder and CEO of Vance Industries, a tech empire worth a little over $9 billion. I built it from a laptop in a cramped dorm room, fueled by cheap coffee and an unwavering belief that a good idea and the grit to see it through were the only currencies that mattered. Boardrooms were my battlegrounds, and hostile takeovers were my art form. I could read a balance sheet like a poem and dismantle a rival's argument with the surgical precision of a master strategist. I didn't inherit a seat at the table, I built the entire goddamn table. But love was a different operating system entirely. It was archaic, messy, and its currency was trust, a commodity I was finding dangerously difficult to quantify. And I was in love with Julian Astor, deeply, truly, inconveniently in love. He was the exception to every rule I had about the world he came from. He was kind when his world taught him to be cutting. He was curious when his peers were complacent. He was an art history professor who saw the beauty in forgotten things. And somehow, he saw the beauty in me. Not Eleanor Vance, the name splashed across financial news headlines, but Eleanor, the woman who still got excited about finding a bug in a line of code and who preferred a quiet night with a book to a gala. He didn't care about my money. He cared about my mind. He was my safe harbor in a life that was otherwise a relentless storm of my own making. The problem wasn't Julian. The problem was the Astors. They were the very definition of old money, a dynasty whose roots were sunk deep into the bedrock of Manhattan society. Their fortune wasn't built. It was curated over generations, passed down through trusts and inheritances, protected by a phalanx of lawyers and a social code more rigid than any law. They didn't measure worth in achievement, but in lineage. The right last name, the right schools, the right summer homes in the Hamptons. They were a closed system, and I, with my working-class parents and my story of building something from nothing, was a glitch in their matrix. We were engaged. The ring, a simple sapphire Julian had chosen because it matched my eyes, felt warm on my finger. But a marriage isn't just a merger of two people. It's a merger of two worlds. Before I bound my life, my legacy, and the empire I had bled for to his, I needed to know. I needed to know if Julian's love was a bridge strong enough to connect our two continents, or if it was a fragile, decorative thing that would shatter under the first tremor of his family's disapproval. I needed data. I needed to run a diagnostic. So I proposed an experiment, a simple, brutal test of character. For one weekend, I told him one evening in my minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park, I'm not going to be Eleanor Vance. Julian looked up from his book, a gentle crease of confusion on his brow. I want to go to your family's home in the Hamptons as someone else. Someone without the $9 billion force field. I laid out the parameters. For one weekend, I would be Ellie, a waitress from Astoria, Queens, a girl who was struggling to make rent, who bought her clothes at thrift stores, and whose only heirloom was a simple silver locket from her grandmother. I would be a woman with nothing to her name but what she carried in her heart. I needed to see how they would treat her. More importantly, I needed to see how Julian would stand up for her. He was deeply uncomfortable. Eleanor, that's insane, he'd said, running a hand through his sandy hair. My family, and they can be a bit formal, but they're not monsters. They're civil. This is unnecessary. Is it, Julian? I had asked, my voice softer than he was used to. Your mother still calls my company that little computer thingy. Your sister asked me if I'd ever considered hiring a stylist to appear more presentable. They tolerate Eleanor Vance because they have to. I need to know if they could ever accept Ellie. And I need to know if you would fight for her. He saw it as a game, a strange, elaborate role-play. He was confident in his family's basic decency, blind to the casual cruelty that was their native tongue. I saw it as a final stress test before committing to the most significant merger of my life. Reluctantly, his love for me overriding his profound misgivings, he agreed. The drive out to the Hamptons was a study in contrasts. I sat in the passenger seat of Julian's vintage Mercedes, wearing a pair of faded jeans and a simple cotton blouse that cost a combined total of $12. My hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and the only makeup I wore was a touch of mascara. In a worn canvas duffel bag at my feet were two more changes of equally modest clothes. I had left my phone, my watch, my entire identity as Eleanor Vance locked away in a safe back in the city. The only piece of my true self I brought with me was the small silver locket around my neck. It had belonged to my grandmother, a woman who had worked as a cleaner her whole life and who had taught me that dignity was something you owned, not something that was given to you. Julian kept glancing at me, a nervous smile playing on his lips. You know, you look beautiful like this, he said, trying to lighten the mood. Very authentic. He used the same word his sister would later use as a weapon. It's just me, Julian, I said quietly, without the armor. The Astor estate wasn't a house. It was a declaration of dominance over the landscape. A sprawling, white-gabled mansion that looked out over the Atlantic Ocean with an air of regal indifference. Manicured lawns rolled down to a private beach, and every window glinted in the afternoon sun like a judgmental eye. As Julian pulled the car to a stop on the crushed gravel driveway, my heart, for the first time in a long time, felt a tremor of genuine fear. Not for my safety, but for my hope. I desperately wanted to be wrong. The moment I stepped out of the car, the test began. Beatrice Astor, Julian's mother, emerged from the grand front entrance. She was a woman sculpted from ice and condescension, her posture perfect, her pearls gleaming. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, conveying a welcome while simultaneously communicating utter disdain. She extended a hand not to shake mine, but to have it held, her fingers limp and cold. Her eyes, a pale, chilly blue, did a swift, brutal inventory of me, from my simple sneakers to my unstyled hair. I felt like a smudge on her otherwise pristine canvas. So you must be Ellie, she said, her voice smooth as silk, but laced with arsenic. Julian has told us so much about you. The pause she left hanging in the air made it clear that whatever he had told them was not nearly enough to explain my presence. Julian, ever the hopeful diplomat, jumped in. Mom, this is Ellie. Ellie, my mother, Beatrice Astor. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Astor, I said, my voice steady. I had negotiated with world leaders. I would not be intimidated by a woman whose greatest accomplishment was marrying well. Beatrice, dear, she corrected gently, withdrawing her hand as if she'd touched something unpleasant. We're all family here. That was when Julian's sister, Caroline, drifted out onto the porch. She was a younger, sharper version of her mother, all angles and expensive highlights. She held a glass of what was probably rosé, and her smile was a shark's. "Oh my God, you're here," she chirped, looking me up and down with an amusement that was anything but kind. "Julian, she's even more rustic than you described." The first few hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as polite conversation. They sat me down in a living room so large and filled with priceless antiques that I felt like I was in a museum. They asked me questions not out of curiosity, but as a way to highlight my otherness. "So, Ellie, what is it you do?" Caroline asked, swirling her wine. "I'm a waitress," I said simply, "at a diner in Astoria." "A waitress? How utterly quaint," Caroline purred, exchanging a look with her mother. "You must have such wonderful stories about ordinary people." They talked about their upcoming trip to Gstaad for skiing, about a recent art auction at Christie's, about the trouble they were having with the staff at their third home in Palm Beach. Every topic was a wall, designed to exclude me, to remind me that I was a tourist in their world, and my visa was about to expire. Julian tried in his gentle, ineffective way to steer the conversation. He'd squeeze my hand under a damask cushion, his thumb rubbing circles on my knuckles, a silent apology that did nothing to stop the bleeding. His defense of me was a series of nervous coughs and weak deflections. "Now, Caroline, be nice," he'd murmur, a plea instead of a command. His weakness was a cold dread seeping into my heart. I hadn't accounted for this variable. I had tested for cruelty, but I hadn't tested for cowardice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the perfect lawn, Beatrice announced that we should prepare for dinner. "I'm sure you'll want to freshen up, Ellie," she said, her eyes flicking to my duffel bag with distaste. "The guest room is at the top of the stairs, the one at the very end of the hall." I knew, without having to be told, that she had put me in the smallest, most remote room, likely next to the staff quarters. Alone in the room, which was still larger than my first apartment, I stood before the mirror. The girl looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. She looked tired. She looked small. But as I leaned closer, I saw the glint in her eyes. It was the same look I got right before closing a deal, the look that told my opponents they had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. I took a deep breath, my fingers closing around the cool metal of my grandmother's locket. The test was far from over, and I was starting to realize I wasn't just here to see if Julian's family would accept me. I was here to see if they were worthy of me. The evidence so far was not promising. Dinner was not a meal, it was a tribunal. The dining room was cavernous, dominated by a long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen. A floral centerpiece the size of a small shrubbery sat in the middle, its fragrant blossoms smelling of money and disregard. The table was set with a bewildering array of silverware, a tiny army of forks and knives for battles I had no intention of fighting. Julian sat to my right, Beatrice at the head of the table, and Caroline opposite me, her smirk a permanent fixture. The conversation began, as I predicted, in a language I was not meant to understand. They spoke of people named Binky and Muffin, of regattas in Newport, and the dreadful quality of the caviar at a recent benefit in Monaco. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed ballet of exclusion, and I was the audience of one they were determined to alienate. I ate slowly, my posture straight, my hands steady. I had sat at tables with prime ministers who tried to use similar tactics of intimidation. The Astors were amateurs, but the context made their efforts uniquely painful. This wasn't business. This was supposed to be family. Julian, to his credit, tried to include me. "Ellie is a wonderful artist, you know," he offered, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "She sketches people." Beatrice arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh? For money, dear? Or is it a hobby?" The question was designed to have no correct answer. If I said it was a hobby, I was frivolous. If I said I did it for money, I was a common street performer. "It's just something I do for myself," I replied evenly, meeting her gaze. "It helps me see people for who they really are." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed her face before the mask of polite indifference slid back into place. Caroline, however, saw the opening. "Speaking of seeing things for what they are," she said, her eyes zeroing in on my neck. "What a charming little necklace. Is it a family piece?" "Yes," I said, my hand instinctively going to the locket. "It was my grandmother's." "It's very simple," Caroline observed, taking a delicate sip of her water. She leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "Tell me, is it real silver?" The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The question was so brazen, so breathtakingly rude, that it hung there for a moment, shimmering with malice. It was a direct assault, not on Ellie the waitress, but on the grandmother who had scrubbed floors so her daughter could have a better life, so that I could exist. They weren't just insulting my present, they were desecrating my past. Julian flinched. "Caroline, that's incredibly inappropriate." His voice was a weak slap on the wrist when a guillotine was required. "What?" "I'm just curious," she said with a theatrical pout. "I have an eye for these things. I'm just trying to educate our little guest." I looked directly at Caroline, my voice quiet but as cold and clear as ice. "Its monetary value is irrelevant. Its worth comes from the woman who wore it. She was the most honest, hard-working person I've ever known." "Some things can't be appraised, Caroline." The directness of my response and the use of her first name without a hint of deference clearly startled her. Beatrice shot me a look of pure venom, a silent rebuke for my impertinence. The rest of dinner passed in a chilly silence, the clinking of their silverware against the porcelain plates the only sound. Julian kept trying to catch my eye, his expression a miserable mix of apology and helplessness, but I wouldn't look at him. Looking at him hurt more than anything his family could say or do. His silence wasn't just a lack of defense, it was an act of quiet complicity. He was allowing them to carve pieces out of me, and he was watching it happen. Just as the dessert plates were being cleared, a new figure appeared in the doorway. Richard Astor, Julian's father, had arrived. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the weary, calculating eyes of a man who thought only in numbers. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone who had never had to hurry in his life. He greeted his wife with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek and nodded at his children. Then his eyes landed on me. "And you are?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth or curiosity. It was the tone of a man cataloguing inventory. "Dad, this is Ellie," Julian said, standing up. My friend." The word friend landed like a punch to my stomach. Not fiancé, not the woman I love. Friend. A temporary designation, a downgrade. Richard's eyes swept over me once, the same dismissive inventory his wife had performed, but his was colder, more pragmatic. He wasn't assessing my social standing, he was assessing my liability. He gave a curt nod and turned his attention to his son. "Julian, a word in my study." It was a command, not a request. As they left the room, I watched them go, a knot of ice forming in my chest. Beatrice and Caroline immediately began whispering to each other, their heads bent together over the table, occasionally glancing up at me with undisguised contempt. I felt utterly alone, an island in a sea of hostility. I excused myself from the table, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. I wandered out onto a stone terrace overlooking the dark, churning ocean. The salty air was cold, but it was clean. It felt like I could breathe for the first time in hours. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and as I walked past I heard Richard's voice, low and sharp. I stopped, knowing I shouldn't listen, but compelled to. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard was saying. "I ran a background check the moment you told me about her. A waitress with $200 in debt to her landlord and a deceased mother who was a librarian. Julian, this isn't a charity. This is our family. Our name. I love her, Dad." Julian's voice was thin, pleading. "Love doesn't balance a ledger," Richard snapped. "A dalliance with the working class is one thing, it can be seen as democratic. But bringing her here, introducing her as a serious prospect, it's an embarrassment. It suggests a weakness of character, a lack of judgment. It will affect how people see you, how they see us. End it. End it before it becomes a genuine problem." There was a pause. I held my breath, praying for Julian to fight, to roar, to defend my honor and his own. I understand," was all he said. My heart didn't break, it simply turned to stone. The last flicker of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that Julian was simply biding his time, died in that hallway. He wasn't my partner. He was their son. And when forced to choose, he had made his allegiance clear. I retreated to my small room at the end of the hall, the one they had so thoughtfully provided. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under my weight. I wasn't Ellie the waitress anymore. I wasn't even Eleanor the CEO. I was just a woman who had gambled her heart on a man who didn't have the courage to hold it. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Julian. He came in and sat beside me on the bed, reaching for my hand. I let him take it, but my fingers were limp, unresponsive. "I'm so sorry about tonight," he whispered. "They were awful, especially Caroline." "What she said about your locket. What did you say to your father, Julian?" I asked, my voice flat. He had the grace to look ashamed. He doesn't understand. He's from a different generation. He thinks in terms of strategy." "He told you to end it," I stated, not as a question. He flinched, his grip on my hand tightening. "He doesn't know you, Eleanor." He had slipped, using my real name in his distress. "If he knew who you really were—" "But he doesn't," I interrupted, pulling my hand away. "He knows Ellie, and so do you. And you let him call her an embarrassment. You let your sister mock her grandmother. You stood by and let them treat her like garbage because you were afraid." "Afraid of what, Julian? Losing your allowance?" "That's not fair," he protested, his voice rising. "You don't understand the pressure. This is my family. This is my whole life. I can't just blow it up." "I wasn't asking you to blow it up," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I was asking you to build a bridge. I was asking you to stand next to me and hold my hand and tell them, this is the woman I love. Her name is Ellie, and you will treat her with respect. That's all I needed, and you couldn't do it." Tears welled in his eyes. He looked young and lost. "Can't you just be patient? Ignore them. Once we're married, it will be different. They'll have to accept you." And there it was. The fatal flaw in his character laid bare. He was asking me to absorb the blows. He was asking me to endure the humiliation, to shrink myself down to fit into the tiny, suffocating box of their approval, all for the promise of a future that he didn't have the spine to build. He wasn't a partner. He was a spectator at my own execution. "The test is over, Julian," I said softly, the last of my affection for him evaporating like mist in the sun. He looked confused. "What? What are you talking about? We're here for the whole weekend. The gala is tomorrow night." "Yes," I said, a new cold clarity settling over me. "The gala. I believe your mother wants me to attend." A plan began to form in my mind. Not a plan of hope or love, but a plan of pure, unadulterated consequence. They had wanted a show. They had treated me as their entertainment. Fine. Tomorrow night, I would give them a performance they would never forget. He looked relieved, mistaking my acquiescence for forgiveness. "Good. It'll be fine. You'll see. We'll get through this." He leaned in to kiss me, but I turned my head, and his lips met my cheek. He sighed, a sound of frustration, before standing up. "I'll let you get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be better, I promise." He left, closing the door softly behind him. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the black expanse of the Atlantic. The moon cast a silver path across the waves, a road leading to somewhere far away from here. Richard Astor was right about one thing. Love didn't balance a ledger, but revenge? Revenge was a different kind of accounting, and I was about to make the Astors pay every last cent of the debt they owed me, with interest. The humiliation wasn't the end of the story. It was just the initial investment. The next morning was a performance of calculated civility. At breakfast, Beatrice treated me with a new, chillingly sweet brand of condescension. It was the kindness one might show to a terminally ill patient or a particularly pathetic stray dog. She called me dear and asked if I had slept well in my cozy little room. Caroline offered me a croissant with a smile that was all teeth. Julian, bless his cowardly heart, seemed to believe this fragile truce was a genuine thaw. He beamed at me across the table, his eyes full of a hopeful, naive love that I now found repulsive. They were playing their parts, confident that the poor little waitress had been put in her place. They had no idea I was merely studying the stage, memorizing my lines and preparing for a final act that would burn their theatre to the ground. The day was a slow, agonizing crawl towards the evening's gala. Beatrice decided it would be educational for me to observe the preparations. This was not a kindness. It was another form of torture. I was forced to trail in her wake as she terrorized florists, caterers, and musicians. She would issue a clipped, impossible command. "The hydrangeas are a shade too blue." I said periwinkle, not cerulean. "Fix it," and then turned to me with a saccharine smile. "You see, Ellie, it's all in the details. One must never, ever settle for mediocrity." Each piece of advice was a veiled insult, a reminder of my perceived station, of my assumed mediocrity. I was her prop, the living embodiment of everything her perfect world was not. The true cruelty, however, was reserved for the afternoon. A few hours before the gala, Beatrice summoned me to her cavernous dressing room, a space larger than most New York apartments, filled with racks of designer gowns and sparkling jewelry. Caroline and Julian were already there. "Now, Ellie," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "we have a bit of a predicament. Julian tells me you didn't bring anything appropriate for a formal event." She gestured vaguely at my simple duffel bag, which a maid had placed in the corner, as if it were a biohazard. "I didn't realize it was a formal requirement," I said, my voice neutral. "Of course it is, dear," she chided gently. "This is the Starlight Charity Gala, not a barn dance." Caroline tittered. Julian looked at the floor. "But," Beatrice continued, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent, "I believe I've found a solution. A way for you to attend without causing Julian any undue embarrassment." She gestured to a garment bag hanging on the back of the door. With a theatrical flourish, she unzipped it. Inside was a maid's uniform. It wasn't a real one. It was a cheap polyester costume from a party store. It had a ridiculously short black skirt, a starchy white apron, and a little frilly cap. It was a caricature, a joke. I stared at it, the silence in the room stretching thin. This was it. This was the masterstroke of their cruelty, the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts. They weren't just excluding me, they were demoting me. They were casting me in the only role they believed I was fit to play, the help. Julian finally found his voice. "Mother." "No," he said, the words barely a whisper. "You can't be serious. That's horrible." "Don't be dramatic, Julian," Beatrice snapped, her facade of kindness dropping for a second. "It's a costume party for her. It's either this or she stays in her room. What would people say if my son's guest showed up in rags? This is a kindness, it's a bit of fun, a novelty." "I won't let her wear that," Julian insisted, taking a step forward. But his protest was a whisper against the hurricane of his mother's will. She turned her icy gaze on him. "You won't let her. You seem to forget your place, Julian. You live in a world that I own, and that your father pays for. You will do as you are told, and your little project will wear the uniform, or she will be on the next bus back to Queens. Am I clear?" Julian's spine, already so fragile, dissolved completely. He deflated, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand, to forgive, to make it easy for him. But I was done making things easy for Julian. I looked from his broken expression to Beatrice's triumphant one. A cold, calm resolve settled over me. This was better than I could have planned. They were handing me the perfect weapon. They thought they were dressing me for my humiliation, but they were actually costuming me for my revenge. "It's okay, Julian," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll wear it." He looked at me in horror. "Ellie, no. You don't have to." "It's fine," I repeated, walking over and taking the garment bag from the hook. I looked directly into Beatrice's eyes, and for the first time, I let her see a flicker of the fire I had been hiding. I wouldn't want to be mediocre. An hour later, I stood in front of the mirror in my little room, dressed in the ridiculous, ill-fitting uniform. The cheap fabric was scratchy against my skin, and the apron was tied in a lopsided bow at my back. It was a costume designed for mockery. But as I stared at my reflection, I didn't see a victim. I saw a soldier putting on her armor. I had planned to reveal the truth after the weekend, in private, to give Julian a chance to choose. But the Astor's cruelty had escalated beyond a simple test of character. This was now a public execution of my dignity, and it demanded a public response. I left my grandmother's locket on the dresser. The woman I was about to become didn't need its comfort. She ran on a different kind of fuel. When I walked down the grand staircase, the Astors were waiting in the foyer. Beatrice and Caroline were resplendent in couture gowns and dripping with diamonds. Julian was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his face a pale mask of misery. When he saw me, he flinched as if he'd been struck. Beatrice clapped her hands together in delight. "Perfect, absolutely perfect. You look just the part, dear. Doesn't she look charming, Julian?" Julian just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. Caroline, however, let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "You clean up nicely, Ellie, for a maid." I gave them a small, tight smile. "I'm ready when you are." The drive to the gala was silent. I sat in the back of the town car, a ghost in their opulent world. I could feel Julian's despair radiating across the seat, but I felt nothing for him now. He had chosen his side. The venue was a grand ballroom in a historic hotel, glittering with chandeliers, and filled with the crème de la crème of New York society. The air hummed with the sound of champagne flutes clinking and the low murmur of powerful people congratulating each other on their own existence. The moment we walked in, I became a spectacle. Beatrice, true to her word, paraded me around like a prize poodle. She clutched my arm, her manicured fingers digging into my skin as she introduced me to her friends. "This is Ellie," she would say with a grand conspiratorial wink. "Julian's charming little project. He's trying to show her how the other half lives. Isn't he a saint?" People would look from my ridiculous uniform to Beatrice's knowing smile and understand the joke immediately. Some offered looks of pity, which were almost worse than the open amusement of others. I was a curiosity, a piece of performance art designed to entertain the bored and wealthy. Through it all, I kept my head high, my expression placid. I met every patronizing glance, every whispered insult, with a calm, unnerving stillness. My silence seemed to unsettle them more than any outburst would have. Julian trailed behind us, a miserable, silent shadow. He looked like a man being led to his own execution. He knew on some level that a line had been crossed, that something irreparable was happening, but he was powerless to stop it. He had surrendered his power, his voice, his very soul, at the altar of his family's approval. The climax, when it came, was as predictable as it was vicious. Caroline, holding a freshly opened bottle of vintage champagne, approached our little group. "Oh, Ellie, you must be so thirsty, running around being so helpful," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Let me get you a glass." As she moved past me, she tripped. It was a clumsy, theatrical stumble that fooled no one. The entire bottle of champagne arced through the air and doused me from head to toe. The cold liquid soaked the cheap fabric of the uniform, plastering it to my skin. The crowd gasped, and then, like a contagion, a wave of laughter rippled through the room. They weren't just laughing at a girl getting soaked. They were laughing at the poor girl being put in her place, at the confirmation of their own superiority. I knelt on the floor, the champagne dripping from my hair onto the polished marble. I looked up and saw Julian frozen in place, his face a canvas of horror and indecision. I saw Caroline, her face alight with triumphant cruelty. And then I saw Beatrice. She leaned down, her face close to mine, her breath smelling of champagne and victory. "Some people," she whispered, her voice a venomous caress, "no matter how much you try to clean them up, will always belong with the trash." That was the moment. The click of the switch. The end of the test and the beginning of the reckoning. The patient warmth of Ellie the waitress vanished, consumed by the cold, calculating fire of Eleanor Vance. I stood up slowly, deliberately. The laughter in the room began to falter, as people saw the expression on my face. It was not the face of a humiliated girl. It was the face of a queen about to pass sentence. I ignored the champagne dripping from my chin. I ignored the whispers. I simply reached into the small apron pocket, the one thing about the costume that was proving useful, and pulled out my phone. Not the cheap burner phone I had been carrying, but my real one, delivered by courier an hour earlier. My thumb moved across the screen, my movements calm and precise. I made a single quiet call. The ballroom was now so silent you could hear the fizz of the champagne puddle on the floor. "Arthur," I said, my voice clear and carrying in the sudden stillness. My personal assistant, my right hand, was on the other end. "Initiate the transfer and put the confirmation on the main screen, now." Across the room, the giant screen behind the stage, which had been displaying images of smiling, underprivileged children, flickered. The Astor's name, proudly displayed next to their $1 million donation, vanished. For a moment, the screen was blank. Then new text appeared. A new, staggering figure materialized in glowing white light. A donation of $50 million had just been made to the Starlight Foundation. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the grand ballroom. Below the amount, in bold, clear letters, were the words that would end the Astor dynasty as they knew it. From Eleanor Vance, founder and CEO of Vance Industries. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered every whisper, every clink of glass. Hundreds of faces, moments ago twisted in amusement at my expense, were now frozen, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, horrified comprehension. They turned from the giant screen to me and back again, as if their eyes could somehow undo the reality that had just been broadcast in 40-foot-high letters. Phones, previously hidden away in pockets and purses, emerged as one, their screens held up to capture the impossible scene. The humiliated maid in a cheap, soaked costume was somehow connected to the $50 million philanthropic bomb that had just detonated in the center of their universe. I watched it all with a serene, detached calm. This was the part of the game I knew best, not the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion, but the clean, cold, irrefutable logic of power and consequence. Beatrice Astor's face was a masterpiece of cracking composure. The polite, condescending mask she wore like a second skin dissolved, revealing the raw, grasping panic beneath. Her skin went from a healthy, champagne-flushed pink to a ghastly, bloodless white. Her perfectly coiffed smile slackened into a slack-jawed gape of horror. She looked at the screen, then at me, her chilly blue eyes wide with a terror that was more satisfying than any apology could ever be. She wasn't just looking at me, she was looking at the ghost of her own social ruin. Caroline, standing beside her, made a small, strangled sound. The champagne bottle she was still holding slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound, sharp and violent, echoed through the profound silence, a perfect punctuation mark to the end of their reign. Slowly, I began to walk. I moved from the center of the room toward the Astor family, who were now frozen in a tragic tableau of their own making. The squish of my soaked, cheap shoes on the polished floor was the only sound in the cavernous ballroom. Every eye followed me. I was no longer an object of pity or scorn. I was an avenging angel in a polyester maid's uniform, and I was coming to collect. I stopped directly in front of Beatrice. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in her hands, the frantic darting of her eyes, as her mind scrambled to process the cataclysm that had just befallen her. She looked from my face to the name on the screen, the gears of her transactional worldview grinding, trying to reconcile the waitress Ellie with Eleanor Vance, CEO. "You," she stammered, the word a dry rasp. "But how—" "You're right about one thing, Beatrice," I said, my voice quiet but carrying with an unnatural clarity across the silent room. It was the voice I used in boardrooms to dismantle opponents twice my age. It was calm, precise, and utterly devoid of mercy. Some people do belong with the trash. I paused, letting the weight of her own words settle back onto her. People who measure a person's soul by the size of their bank account. People who find joy in the humiliation of others because it's the only way they can feel big. People who raise their children to be cruel in public and cowards in private. My eyes flicked to Caroline, who visibly flinched, her face pale and her eyes filled with a new kind of fear, the fear of irrelevance. Then, finally, I turned to Julian. He looked like he had been hollowed out, a beautiful, empty shell of a man. His face was a portrait of utter devastation, a ruin of conflicting emotions. There was shock, betrayal, and a dawning, sickening understanding of the magnitude of his failure. He was looking at me, but he wasn't seeing Ellie or Eleanor. He was seeing the ghost of the life he had just thrown away, the kingdom he had abdicated for the approval of jesters. "I wanted a partner, Julian," I said, and for the first time a genuine crack of pain entered my voice. It was the last remnant of the love I'd had for him, the final echo of a future that would never be. I needed a partner, someone who would stand with me, not behind me, someone who would fight for me, not just watch me bleed. My voice dropped to a near whisper, a private condemnation in a public forum. "You didn't fail my test. You failed yourself." He reached a hand out toward me, his lips forming my name. "Eleanor, I didn't know." "That's the point," I said, cutting him off. "You shouldn't have needed to know. My worth, my dignity, shouldn't have been dependent on my net worth. The woman you claimed to love was kneeling on the floor, covered in champagne, and you did nothing." I took a small step back, creating a chasm between us that I knew would never be crossed. "You saw a liability, a problem to be managed. You didn't see a person." With deliberate slowness, I reached behind my neck and unclasped the simple silver locket my grandmother had given me, the locket Caroline had questioned, the symbol of the past they had deemed worthless. I held it in my palm for a moment, its familiar weight a comfort and a farewell. Then I stepped forward and gently dropped it into Julian's outstretched hand. His fingers closed around it, the cool metal a stark contrast to his clammy skin. "This was my grandmother's," I said, my voice clear and strong once more for all the room to hear. "She was a cleaner, and she had more class, more integrity, and more honor in her little finger than your entire family has in its whole gilded history. This cheap piece of silver is worth more than all of you. I held his gaze for a final, heartbreaking moment. I saw the man I had loved, and I saw the coward he had chosen to become. They were one and the same. There was nothing left to say. Without another glance at the Astors, without a single look at the hundreds of stunned faces watching me, I turned my back on them all. I turned and walked away. I walked through the parted sea of tuxedos and diamond necklaces, my head held high, the squish of my shoes a steady rhythmic beat of departure. I walked out of the grand ballroom, out of the opulent hotel, and out of Julian Astor's life forever. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could already imagine the scene I had left behind, the frantic whispers erupting into a cacophony, the reporters who had been covering the gala suddenly realizing they had a much bigger story, the Astors standing alone in the ruins of their reputation. My revenge wasn't in the $50 million I had donated. That was just the delivery system. The money was a tool, a language they understood. My real revenge was in the truth I had revealed. I had held up a mirror to New York's elite and shown them their own ugly reflection. I had proven in the most public and irrefutable way possible that true class has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character. And the Astors, in front of the entire world, had just declared moral bankruptcy. As I stepped out into the cool, cleansing night air of the city, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The cold air felt good on my skin, washing away the sticky residue of the champagne and the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. I was still wearing the ridiculous maid's uniform, my hair was still damp and sticky, but I had never felt more powerful, more myself. A black town car, the same one I'd arrived in, pulled up to the curb. My driver, a man who had been with me for years and knew my real identity, got out and opened the back door for me. He looked at my state of dress, a single eyebrow raised in a silent question. "Long night, Robert," I said with a small, tired smile. "So it would seem, Miss Vance," he replied, his expression unreadable as always. As I slid into the plush leather seat, I saw my reflection in the tinted window. A woman in a cheap maid's costume, her mascara slightly smudged, her hair a mess, but her eyes were clear, steady, and shining with a hard, brilliant light. The girl they had tried to break was gone. In her place was a woman who had been reminded of exactly who she was. The test had been for them, but the lesson had been for me. I had been looking for a partner to build a bridge between two worlds, but I now understood I didn't need a bridge. I owned my world, and anyone who wanted to enter it would have to prove they were worthy. I leaned my head back against the seat, the city lights blurring past the window, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely, and gloriously free. The ledger was finally balanced. The ride back to my penthouse was a silent, surreal journey through the neon-veined canyons of Manhattan. I watched the city blur past, a kaleidoscope of a million lives intersecting, each a story of its own. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the car, still clad in my ridiculous damp uniform, I felt like a visitor from another planet. Just hours ago, I had been Ellie, the waitress, a powerless pawn in a cruel game. Now, I was Eleanor Vance again, but the name felt different. The armor I had shed for the weekend had been reforged in the fires of their contempt, and it was stronger, lighter, and more perfectly fitted than ever before. Robert dropped me at the private entrance to my building. The doorman, a kind-faced man named Frank who had known me for years, did a remarkable job of not reacting to my appearance. He simply gave me a warm, respectful nod. "Welcome home, Miss Vance. Tough night?" "You have no idea, Frank," I said, a genuine smile finally reaching my lips, but a productive one. Upstairs, in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I stripped off the maid's costume. I balled it up, the scratchy polyester, the stupid frilly apron, and dropped it directly into the trash incinerator chute in my utility room. I watched the small metal door close, imagining the cheap fabric turning to ash, a final, definitive act of purification. I stood under the scalding spray of my shower for a long time, letting the water wash away the champagne, the scent of the Astors' perfumed ballroom, and the last lingering traces of their toxicity. I wasn't washing away a memory, I was cleansing a wound. As the water streamed over me, I didn't feel sadness or regret. The pain had been real, a sharp, piercing blade to the heart, but it had already begun to scar over, leaving behind not weakness, but a hard-won resilience. The Julian I had loved was an idea, a projection of the kindness and strength I had hoped to find. The real Julian, the one who had stood by and watched me drown, was a stranger, and you cannot mourn a stranger. When I finally stepped out, wrapped in a thick white towel, my phone was buzzing relentlessly on the marble vanity. It was a symphony of destruction. News alerts, texts from my board members, frantic emails from my PR team. The story had exploded. Astor Gala and Eleanor Vance were the top 2 trending topics worldwide. A dozen different news outlets had already published grainy cell phone videos of the moment the screen changed, of my quiet, cold speech, of my final, lonely exit. The narrative was clear, and it was brutal. A powerful self-made billionaire had gone undercover to test the character of her fiancé's family, and they had failed in the most spectacularly public fashion imaginable. I ignored the calls. I read a few of the headlines, a clinical satisfaction settling over me. Vance punks Astor's in $50 million mic drop. Society wedding scuttled as tech mogul exposes old money rot. Maid in Manhattan, how Eleanor Vance used a costume to unmask the real fakes. They were painting me as a folk hero, a corporate vigilante who had brought the arrogant aristocracy to its knees. I knew the reality was more complex, more personal, but I was happy to let them have their narrative. It served my purpose. I slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the first in months. The question that had been haunting me, the uncertainty about Julian and our future, had been answered. The data was in, the experiment was complete, and the conclusion was irrefutable. There was a strange peace in that finality. The next morning, I was back in my true uniform, a razor-sharp business suit, minimalist jewelry, and an air of unshakable authority. My first meeting was with Arthur, my assistant, and my head of public relations, a sharp woman named Zara. "The fallout," Zara said, scrolling through her tablet with a grimly satisfied expression, "is biblical. Astor family stock, whatever little is publicly traded, has taken a significant hit. Richard Astor is facing calls to step down from 2 major charity boards. Their phones are disconnected. Rumor has it they've fled the Hamptons. You haven't just embarrassed them, Eleanor. You've vaporized them." "Good," I said, sipping my black coffee. "Any word from Julian?" Arthur, ever discreet, cleared his throat. "He has called 73 times. He has also appeared at the main entrance of the building 4 times and been politely turned away by security. He sent a package, which we scanned. It contains the locket and a 30-page handwritten letter." "Burn the letter," I said without hesitation. "Return the locket to my grandmother's jewelry box and block his number from all my devices. He no longer exists." They both nodded, understanding the finality in my tone. There was no room for negotiation. "What's our move?" Zara asked. "Do you want to issue a statement? Do a tell-all interview? We could control this narrative for weeks." I considered it for a moment. I could go on television, tell my story, and become a champion for the downtrodden, a symbol of meritocracy triumphing over nepotism. But that wasn't me. The act itself was the statement. The $50 million spoke louder than I ever could. "No," I said. "We say nothing. We go back to work. We just closed the acquisition of a major AI firm. Let's focus on that. The story of last night is over. The story of Vance Industries is just beginning. Let the world talk. We have an empire to run." It was a power move, and Zara knew it. My silence would be more damning than any statement. It communicated that the Astors were so insignificant, so beneath my notice that they weren't even worth a follow-up comment. Their entire world had ended, and for me it was just a Tuesday. The days that followed were a blur of focused, relentless work. I poured all the energy that I had once dedicated to my relationship with Julian back into my company, my true love. It was a welcome distraction, a familiar comfort. In the world of code and contracts, the rules were clear. There were no hidden motives, no polite cruelties disguised as jokes. There was only logic, efficiency, and the elegant, satisfying pursuit of a goal. But even in the sterile environment of my office, the ghost of what had happened lingered. It came in unexpected moments. I'd see a headline and feel a faint echo of the pain. I'd be in a meeting and my mind would drift back to the feel of the cheap, scratchy uniform on my skin. One afternoon, my grandmother's locket was returned to my desk by Arthur. I picked it up, the silver cool against my palm. I thought of the woman who had worn it, of her quiet strength and unwavering dignity. She had faced a lifetime of disrespect from people like the Astors, but she had never let them diminish her. She had known her own worth, independent of anyone else's validation. In that moment I understood her and my own journey, more deeply than ever before. The test wasn't just about Julian or his family. It was about me. It was about proving to myself that I could walk through the fire of their judgment and emerge not just unscathed but stronger. A week after the gala, I was working late when Arthur buzzed my intercom. "Miss Vance, there's a visitor here to see you. It's Beatrice Astor." I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. Of all the possible outcomes, this was one I hadn't anticipated. My first instinct was to have security remove her. But then, a different impulse took over. Curiosity. I needed to see what a queen looked like when her castle had turned to dust. "Send her up," I said. A few minutes later, Beatrice Astor was escorted into my office. The change in her was staggering. The proud, imperious woman from the Hamptons was gone. In her place was a diminished, haggard figure. She wore a simple, expensive-looking but understated dress. Her hair was still perfect, but her face was pale and drawn, the skin around her eyes tight with sleepless nights. She was holding a large leather handbag with both hands, clutching it like a shield. She stood awkwardly in the middle of my office, a vast, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She looked small and out of place, a relic from a bygone era. "Eleanor," she began, her voice thin and reedy, a shadow of its former commanding tone. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't stand up. I didn't offer her a seat. I simply swiveled in my chair to face her, my expression unreadable. "What do you want, Beatrice?" She flinched at the coldness of my tone. I came to apologize. What happened? What we did? It was unforgivable. We were wrong. The apology was as hollow as a drum. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry for the consequences. She was sorry her friends were shunning her, sorry her husband's business partners were pulling out of deals, sorry her entire world had been set on fire. "You're not sorry," I said flatly. "You're ruined. There's a difference." Tears welled in her eyes, real tears this time. "Please," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "My family is falling apart. Richard is a pariah. Caroline won't leave her apartment. And Julian, he's a ghost. He doesn't eat. He doesn't speak. He just sits in his room holding that locket." The mention of Julian sent a sharp, unwelcome pang through my chest. I pushed it down. "That is the consequence of your actions, Beatrice, not mine." "But you can fix it," she pleaded, her composure finally breaking. "You're a powerful woman. Issue a statement. Say it was a misunderstanding, a social experiment gone wrong. Tell them we've learned our lesson. Anything. You can give us our lives back." I stared at her, a kind of weary pity replacing my anger. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was about money and influence, about PR and damage control. She thought my dignity was a commodity that could be bought back for her with a well-worded press release. "Your life," I said, standing up and walking to the window, my back to her. "The life you had was a fantasy built on a foundation of cruelty and exclusion. It was a house of cards, and all I did was pull one out from the bottom. It was destined to fall. You just thought you would never have to pay the price." I turned to face her. "You didn't come here to apologize to me. You came here to ask me to save you from yourselves. But I'm not a savior, Beatrice, and you are not worth saving. The world has changed. The future is being built by people who create things, not by people who inherit them. Your era is over. You just happened to be present for the eulogy." I walked to my desk and pressed the intercom. "Arthur, please show Mrs. Astor out." Defeated, Beatrice gave one last pleading look, then turned and allowed herself to be escorted from my office. As she left, I felt a profound sense of closure. My revenge was complete, not because I had destroyed her, but because I had refused to save her. I had forced her to live in the world she had created. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. Life, unlike code, is rarely so clean, and the final chapter, the one I never saw coming, was not about the Astors. It was about the $50 million and the man it brought back into my life.